Okay, so then how do we develop a team? Certainly we recognize that we're responsible and there's a benefit to having a team within the church so that the pastor and the board are working together. But how do we develop that kind of team? How do we implement that? Because oftentimes when we go into the small church, there's not this concept. Oftentimes it's actually very opposite, that the pastor is given the responsibility for the spiritual leadership, and the board takes care of all the organizational things. And so sometimes there's even a hostile environment, both from the lay perspective. Oftentimes they view the leadership with suspicion, but also on the pastoral level. Now I've heard many pastors who are frustrated and they're suspicious of their board, and they always see their board as someone there who's seeking to hinder their ministry rather than someone who complements their ministry. And so how do we develop this kind of team ministry and this team philosophy of ministry? Well, there's several things we need to do. First of all, the first step is we need to look for and recruit team players. See, when we look for individuals to serve on the board, what kind of individuals are we looking for? Well, we want individuals who become part of the team. And I think there's several things we need to look for. First of all, we need to look for teachable people. That there are individuals who desire to learn. There are individuals who want to be taught. There are individuals who are teachable. They recognize that they need to learn from others. So they're not dogmatic, but they're willing to listen. That's a teachable person. So that's the first type of person we want, is someone who's teachable. Secondly, we want someone who's submissive. Now again, this does not mean that the person is always a yes person, but rather they're an individual who comes without any personal agendas. That they come with their ideas, but they're not demanding of their ideas. That's a submissive person. They are concerned about the needs of others rather than their own. Thirdly, we want to look for people of faith. They're not stingy or afraid to take risks. They're instead governed by the Great Commission, and they have faith in what God can accomplish through the church and through the leadership of the church, even though that church may be small. So instead of seeing all the problems in the church, they see all the opportunities that God can do through the church. And they trust God for that. They trust God to provide. And so they're willing to take risks. They're people of faith. Fourthly, we want to look for people who's open to change. That doesn't mean that we're going to go in and we're going to change everything. Oftentimes, some of the advice is given, and I believe it's sound advice, that before you change anything in your church, you need to be there at least a year. But we also have to recognize that change is part of growth. There can be no growth without change. In fact, God is a God of change. He's constantly changing. And if we're to grow in our relationship with God, we need to be changing. And so we want to look for individuals who are open to change. They're not rigid. They're not tied solely to tradition or the past way of doing things, but they're willing to make changes. Recognizing that the gospel, our message never changes, but the methods by which we communicate that gospel, the methods by which we conduct the church, need to change as the situation changes. And so they're open to that. And then lastly, we want to look for people who possess spiritual wisdom. Now again, in the small church, the danger is we can select our leadership because of tribal connections. Now oftentimes it is true that individuals who are the power brokers in the church have gained that position because of their spiritual wisdom. The reason they are people of influence is because people look up to them for spiritual insight. And that's a great benefit in the church. But we need to be careful that we don't just look for these tribal connections. We want to look for individuals who are spiritually wise, who are sensitive, who have godly perception. So that's the first thing we want to do. If we're going to develop an effective team, we want to recruit a good team player in the church. Secondly, we need to spend time with the leadership in mentoring relationships. One of the problems we often are confronted with in terms of the small church is that as we go into a small church, we go in with the idea we need good leadership, and we want strong leadership, and we want spiritually mature leadership. But as we come into the small church, all of a sudden we find ourselves dealing with a vacuum of leadership. That there's not spiritually mature individuals. And so what do? In fact, sometimes in some situations, if we're going into a small church that is need to be revitalized, perhaps there's someone who's not even a born-again believer on the board. So what do? Well, the thing that we need to do is then start developing mentoring relationships. So instead of bemoaning the fact that we don't have a strong leadership base, we begin training those individuals and assisting them and coming alongside of them and mentoring them to become mature so that they begin to develop a biblical mindset. Now, that's not going to happen overnight. It may take several years. It may take years to accomplish. But that's what the early church found. When they established the early church in the beginning of the early church, they had the same problem. Because they didn't have a base of mature believers and a pool from which they could draw. They were all new believers. And so what they had to do is come along and begin to teach them and instruct them. And so part of the pastoral epistles was to train and instruct individuals about leadership. And so that's what we need to do. We need to develop that kind of mentoring relationship. And that's not just something we do formally. In fact, most of our mentoring does not occur in a formal situation. Because the small church is a relationally driven church, most of our mentoring, most of our discipleship will come on an informal basis. It's as we spend time with them, as we go out and help a farmer during harvest, that we spend time with them, begin to interact with them and share with them a biblical perspective. And so that's what we need to do to develop spiritually mature individuals on the board. So we need to spend time with the leadership in a mentoring relationship. And then third, we need to provide training for lay leadership. You see, in order for them to work as a team, they need to understand and be in agreement with the basic philosophy of ministry and leadership. And so how do we do that? We begin to teach them, and we need to begin to instruct them. First of all, we need to instruct them about what it means to be an organizational leader. What does it mean to set goals? And why are goals important? Why is it setting a direction for the church important? And why do we need a unifying vision for the church? We need to train them in that. And then secondly, we need to train them also in spiritual leadership. What does it mean to be a spiritual leader? What does it mean to provide spiritual oversight? I believe that one of the reasons why small churches struggle in leadership on the board is because we as pastors have failed to teach them what it means. And we need to come alongside and begin to instruct them on what that means. And then thirdly, we need to train them in terms of how they can utilize their spiritual gifts in ministry. We need to come alongside and help them become involved in ministry and train them so that they're utilizing their spiritual gifts in a way that benefits the body of Christ. So we need to train our leaders. We need to be intentional in that training. And we need to instruct them. Then the fourth thing that we need to do to develop an effective team ministry is to provide ongoing support for them. This means that we support them in their ministry as they minister to the whole congregation. It means that we provide spiritual support as well, so that we come alongside and encourage them and strengthen them in their leadership. So we're there to support them. We're not there to try to destroy their authority or undermine their authority. We're not there to try to demand that they follow our direction, but rather we come alongside to support them and encourage them. And then fifth, we need to develop a clearly defined roles and responsibilities within the leadership. One of the difficulties in the small church oftentimes is that misunderstandings arise because roles and responsibilities, especially the role of the board and the responsibility of the pastor, have never really been clearly defined. And so as a result of that, we come with different expectations. And we need to sit down and define those roles. And who is responsible for what and how will it work? So that they have a clear idea of their responsibility. Then we need to provide mutual evaluation. You see, part of growth is evaluating. But the problem is, oftentimes people are threatened by evaluations because they see it as a threat to them. And so we need to develop an atmosphere where we're not afraid to evaluate one another and encourage one another. And that begins with us as pastors. That if we desire to evaluate them or give them input in terms of how they can do their responsibility more effectively, we need to be willing and open for them to do the same thing for us. We need to be willing to listen and to evaluate them and have them evaluate us so we can set an example for them. So as we do these, we can develop a more effective team within the church. Now, this is not a guaranteed formula. It takes time to develop a team ministry. And it begins by us being committed to the task that we want to have our leadership. We want to have our board working together as a team. We want their input. Because nothing will kill a team more than just the development of an atmosphere that we don't want their input. And even if we never communicate that openly, if we're communicating it subtly through our actions, it will destroy the effectiveness of a team. And so we want a team that works together. We want to encourage that. Now, as we think about especially defining roles and responsibilities, and as we want to teach that to the board, what is the role of the board? What is the responsibility of the board? Well, there's several ingredients, I believe, in terms of an effective board and their accomplishing their responsibility. The first one, and perhaps the most important, but also the one that is perhaps most overlooked, is that the board is responsible to be individuals of prayer. In Acts chapter 6, verse 4, in that very familiar passage of the establishment of deacons, remember the church was getting bogged down in some of the organizational tasks of the church, and so the leadership team came together and they said, no, we don't want to get bogged down in taking care of all the organizational things. Let's appoint some men to take care of that, some deacons. And so they did. They appointed the deacons to take care of some of the organizational functions within the church. Why? So they could devote themselves to the study of the Word and to prayer. So that prayer is to be central to the leadership. Oftentimes when a board gets together, here's something how a board meeting goes. It begins with the pastor sitting down and saying, okay, well, why don't Fred over here open us in prayer? And so Fred gives the general prayer about, Lord, bless our decisions, give us a direction in your will, and 3 minutes later his prayer is done, and then we move on to the business of the church. And we fail to realize that the most important thing we do in a board meeting is the time we spend in prayer. That we need to be committed to spending significant time in prayer as a board, not only for the direction of the church and the ministries for the church, but also for individuals within the church, to the situations they're facing and the crisis points that they're facing in their life. In fact, I think a good challenge, a good starting point would be to commit to have at least 1/4 of our time in our board meetings spent solely in prayer, as well as taking time out just periodically to say our whole board meeting is going to be devoted strictly to prayer. as foundational to the church and as foundational to our leadership. So the board is certainly, first of all, responsible to pray. Secondly, we see that the board is responsible to teach others. We see in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, that one of the qualifications of a board member is that you're to be apt to teach or able to teach. Now, does that mean that a board member must be gifted in teaching? I don't believe so, because teaching goes far beyond the formal setting. Certainly, the individual who has the gift of teaching has the ability in a very formal setting to communicate God's truth. But that's not just all that teaching is. There's teaching that goes on informally. And what Paul, I believe, is saying there is that a leader is someone who can take the truths of God and communicate it effectively to individuals to apply it to their situation. And most often that will occur in an informal basis. So a leader then, and the board member, is responsible to be able to instruct others. It begins in his home, it begins in his family, but also begins with his friends and his neighbors who are, when they're faced with problems, he can communicate God's truth to them. He may not be a person who can get up front and lead an adult Sunday school class. I remember one time we had an individual on our board who was so afraid and nervous about getting up front that if he got up front and started to teach a Sunday school class, he would literally just break down in tears because it was so stressful to him. But yet he was also an effective teacher. Not in that setting, not in the Sunday school setting, but in daily life settings. He was able to communicate God's word effectively to the situation that people were facing. So one-on-one, he was an effective teacher. That's what I believe what Paul is telling Timothy. That a board is responsible to teach others, to communicate God's truth to others, to communicate doctrine, to communicate the meaning of Scripture to others. Third, the board is responsible to protect the congregation. In Ezekiel chapter 3, we find that God is calling Ezekiel to be a watchman of Israel. Ezekiel chapter 3, beginning at verse 17, he says, "Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel, so hear the word I speak and give them warning from me. When I say to the wicked man, you will surely die, and you do not warn him or speak out to dissuade him from his evil ways, in order to save his life, that wicked man will die for his sin, and I will hold you accountable for his blood. But if you do warn him, the wicked man, and he does not turn from his wickedness or from his evil ways, he will die for his sins, but you will have saved yourself. Again, when a righteous man turns from his righteousness and does evil, and I put a stumbling block before him, he will die. Since you did not warn him, he will die for his sins. The righteous thing he did will not be remembered, and I will hold you accountable for his blood. But if you do warn the righteous man not to sin, and he does not sin, he will surely live because he took warning, and you will have saved yourself." You see, in the picture that he gives here to Ezekiel would have been one that was very familiar. That was a watchman who was appointed to stand on the wall, and his job was to look out in terms of the surrounding country to look for any dangers, an invading army that might be threatening them. So there was that sense of outwardly watching for anything that was a threat to the well-being of the people. But not only outwardly, but he was also responsible to watch inwardly into the inner part of the city, in the walled city, to make sure that there was not any threat within the city, such as a fire or perhaps a thief or someone else who was a threat in the city. And that's the picture of a watchman, that he was both watching for external dangers and internal dangers. And that's a responsibility of the board. that part of our role and responsibility, that as we see in Acts chapter 20, is to watch for those on the outside who are a threat to the church and to those on the inside who are a threat to the church. And we're to warn them and warn the congregation. And to confront that which would be a threat. It involves confronting individuals when they are starting down the road of rebellion against God. And so part of the responsibility of the board is to conduct church discipline. And sometimes this can be very difficult in a small church. Because the small church is very relationally connected, sometimes the leadership is reluctant to conduct church discipline on someone because they're related to other people within the church. But we need to recognize that part of our role and responsibility is to be watchmen. And part of that is to conduct church discipline. And so we need to instruct the board on how to do that and to challenge them to do that. Fourth, the board is responsible to be leaders. Romans chapter 12 verse 8 and Hebrews chapter 13 verse 17. Paul reminds us that we're responsible to be leaders in the church who watch over the spiritual health of the congregation. In Hebrews chapter 13 verse 17, the writer of Hebrews says, "Obey your leaders and submit to their authority." Now what is their authority? How do we outwork that authority? Certainly there is authority given the leadership of the church. Well, here's how we're to use that authority, he says. "They keep watch over you as men who must give an account. Obey them so that their work will be a joy, not a burden, for that would be of no advantage to you." See, we see that leadership in a biblical perspective is different than in a secular perspective. When we think of leadership, what first comes to mind is decision making. Who calls the shots? Who makes the decisions? And certainly that is part of leadership. But that's a minor part to what the writer of Hebrews is pointing towards. And the writer of Hebrews is pointing us to the fact that a leader keeps watch over them. That we will give an account for how we're overseeing the spiritual well-being of the church. And so that's part of our responsibility, that we oversee the big picture of what's happening within the church and what's happening in the ministries of the church and what's happening in the lives of people as a result of those ministries. And we're seeking to strengthen that, encourage that, so that we are examining the direction of the church to assess whether the church is fulfilling its biblical mission that God has given it. The board is responsible to administrate the organization of the church. 1 Timothy chapter 5 verse 17 makes it clear that there is an administration that's necessary within the church. That's part of the responsibility of the board. That also involves policies. That one of the responsibilities of the church is to develop sound policies. Because what are the policies that we're established? Policies are necessary because they are to assure that the church is doing business, if you would, in a way that honors Christ. In the small church, oftentimes we're reluctant to set policy. But it's important that we set policies in areas that we believe are crucial. For example, in terms of Christian workers or Christian ministry and working with children policies so that we're assuring that we're protecting children from the sexual predators that have permeated our culture today. That's part of making sure we're doing things rightly, because if something happens and we didn't protect ourselves from it, it not only can put us in a legal bind, but it, more importantly, maligns the character of God. And we need to be careful of that. That's why we need sound policies. We need good planning. Proverbs chapter 21 verse 5 and 24 verse 17 point out that planning is not a violation of faith, but it's actually essential in the outworking of our faith. And so part of the organizational structures of a church and responsibility of the board is to provide some of that organizational oversight, to develop good planning. 6, the board is responsible to equip people for ministry. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 through 12 talk about the leadership given to the church to equip people for ministry. So as a board, we are responsible to come alongside and equip people. And how do we do that? Well, I think there's 2 areas in particular that the board is responsible for. First is in the area of ministry training. We need to make sure that people are being trained in terms of how they can do their ministry. That training can be done formally, it can be done informally, it can be done by providing for seminars for people to go to, or it can be done by in-house training. There's a number of different types of training that we can do. But we need to recognize part of the responsibility of the board is to make sure that training is available and people are taking advantage of that training. And then secondly, equipping people involves providing them the resources that they need so that they have the necessary resources. That may mean financial resources, it may mean facilities, whatever the resources that they are, that the board makes sure that they're being provided for the people to do their ministry. Seventh, the board is responsible to facilitate change. Again, as we pointed out, that growth, whether it's numerical growth or more importantly, even spiritual growth within the church, growth cannot happen without change. And so as leaders, we need to be change agents because God is in the business of conducting changes in the lives of people. And so without change, the church becomes stagnant. That doesn't mean we're always mixing the pot to change everything, but it means that we're always willing to lead the church into new ventures, into new direction, that we're willing to implement those changes. That the board is to be a change agent within the church. Eighth, the board is responsible to resolve conflicts. Again, as we look in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, when conflicts arose, how oftentimes it was the leadership who took the initiative to resolve those conflicts. In Acts chapter 11, and Acts chapter 15. We also find an example of that in Philippians chapter 4, verse 2, where Paul takes a very direct approach to resolve a conflict between 2 individuals within the church there at Philippi. And so the board is responsible to resolve those conflicts. Not just the pastor, but the board as well. And working together as a team to resolve those issues. So that when conflicts arise, we're taking a proactive approach to deal with those disputes. We don't ignore them, because if we do, they only intensify. So we need to teach our boards how to be more effective in resolving conflicts. Then ninth, the board is responsible to shepherd the congregation. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 2, in challenging the elders, Peter makes this statement. Let me go back to verse 1 just to pick up the context. He says, "To the elders among you I appeal as a fellow elder, a witness of Christ's suffering, and one who is also will share to the glory to be revealed." So notice here several things. First of all, he says to the elders. He's not talking about one individual, but he's talking about to the leadership of the church, to those individuals who were all responsible for the leadership. Then verse 2, "Be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, serving as overseers, not because you must, but because you're willing as God wants you to be, not greedy for money, but eager to serve." So he talks about our motivation. Our motivation is not to be self-motivated, but rather for the motivation of benefiting them, of encouraging them, to serving them. Verse 3, not lording it over those entrusted to you. In other words, it's not about the exercise of power, but, he says, last part of verse 3, but being examples to the flock. In other words, it's about modeling Christ before them. So we're to be shepherds of the flock. We're to overview the care of the flock to make sure that it's spiritually growing, that it's getting the spiritual diet that it needs of the Word of God. And then we're to model it before them. And then what happens when we do this? Well, verse 4, when we find that we're doing this kind of leadership, verse 4, and when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that will never fade away. So when we're providing spiritual oversight, when we're providing an example and we're serving the congregation as leaders, we find that's the kind of leader that is rewarded by God. And that's the kind of leaders that we're to be. We're to be spiritual leaders. And then lastly, the board is responsible to support the pastor. One of the roles of the responsibility, and we need to teach this to the board, is that they're responsible to come alongside and assist the pastor and support the pastor. And they do this several ways, I believe. First of all, by making sure our financial needs are met. That's part of the responsibility of the board. And to make sure, secondly, that we're not neglecting our family. The tragedy of ministry is that many pastors have sacrificed their family in the name of ministry. And part of the responsibility of the board to challenge us, and we need to teach them this and challenge them to hold us accountable, is to make sure that we're taking care of our family first in the ministry. And then lastly, as part of our growth as individuals. So the board has come alongside in supporting us. That's part of an effective team in ministry. Because the strength of the church, I am convinced that the strength of the church will only be as strong as the strength of the team work between the pastor and the board. A church that does not have a good teamwork between the pastor and the board working together to provide direction and oversight and ministry in the church will never become a healthy church. This is where it begins, is with the board. But it doesn't just stop with the board. Not only do we need to provide the development of a team within the context of the board, but then we need to develop teamwork within the whole congregation. That we want to build, not just within the board, so that we want to build within the church an atmosphere, a mindset that as a church we're working together as a team to build the church, to strengthen the church, to accomplish the mission of the church. And so how do we do that? How do we broaden this now from the board's perspective to the whole church, so that we're not just the board and the pastor working together, but now the whole church is working together to accomplish the Great Commission? Well, it involves developing the right environment within the church. That we are developing an environment that promotes team. And again, this requires a trusting environment where we trust, first of all, one another, and then secondly, we trust God to provide the empowerment that we need. So that as we're doing ministry within the church, we no longer are looking at the lack of resources, but we're trusting that God will provide everything we need. In the small church, oftentimes we look at what we don't have in ministry. We look at our limitations. And those limitations can be financial, they can be in our facilities, they can be in the number of volunteers that we have. And so we develop a ministry that's negative oriented, that focuses upon what we don't have, rather than trusting in God and recognizing that God has assured us He will give us everything we need. He will give us the spiritual empowerment we need. He will give us all the resources we need. He'll give us all the time we need. He'll give us all the giftedness that we need. He will give us everything we need to accomplish His purpose. See, that's a trusting environment. And so we want to develop that within the church. Secondly, we want to develop an empowering environment. It's interesting. Turn over to in Matthew chapter 10. When Christ sent out His disciples on this first missionary, if you would, missionary venture, He says there, beginning in verse 1, that He called His 12 disciples to Him and gave them authority to drive out evil spirits and to heal every weakness. It's interesting. The first thing that Christ did before He sent them out is that He empowered them for the task. He gave them the empowerment they needed to accomplish the task. Paul understood this in Philippians chapter 4, verse 13, where he says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So we need to recognize and encourage and challenge and teach people that they are empowered already to accomplish ministry. But as He empowered them, notice how He did several things. First of all, He clarified their responsibility. Verses 5 through verse 10. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Do not go among the Gentiles or any inner town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. As you go, preach this message. The kingdom of heaven is near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. Do not take any gold or silver or copper in your belts. Take no bag for the journey or extra tunic or sandals or a staff, for the worker is worth his keep. But notice, as Christ empowered them for ministry, He then clarified to them what is it they were to do. You see, the first thing we do, if we want to develop an empowering ministry, not only do we need to teach people about the empowerment of the Holy Spirit, but we need to clarify for them what is it they're responsible to do. What is their task? But not only did He clarify, He then gave them authority and freedom to do that. Verse 11. Whatever town or village you enter, search for someone worthy person there and stay at his house until you leave. As you enter the house, give it your greeting. If the home is deserving, let your peace rest on it. If it is not, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake the dust off your feet when you leave that home or town. I tell you the truth, it will be more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. Now, it's interesting in that statement, the amount that Christ gives them in terms of empowering them or giving the authority to them and the freedom to exercise their ministry. He says when you enter into city, He gives them the responsibility to find someone. He gives them the authority to either give a blessing or a curse upon that city. You see, when we want to empower people for ministry, not only do we need to clarify to them what is it they're accomplishing, but then we need to empower them. We need to give them the authority and the freedom to accomplish that as they see fit. So we're not micromanaging. Because part of developing a team ministry is come alongside and equipping them, empowering them, and then giving them the freedom to accomplish it. That's what Christ did. But within that, there's also accountability. For we find in verses 28 to 31. Let's go back to verse 26. He says, do not be afraid of them. There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What I tell you in the dark, speak in the daylight. What is whispered in your ear, proclaim from the roofs. Now verse 28. Here we find accountability. Do not be afraid of those who will kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both his soul and body in hell. You see, there's accountability. That Christ makes it clear that as they're going out to do their responsibility, to accomplish their ministry, they need to recognize there is accountability built within that. That they are accountable to God, that God will hold them responsible. So as we look at ministry and we want to empower people for ministry, we don't just give them the task, but we also help them to realize they are accountable. And what are they accountable for? Well, I think they're accountable for several things in ministry. First of all, they're accountable for obedience. That if they're to be involved in the ministry of the church, they need to be obedient to Christ. That if they're not living in obedience to Christ, then there will be the confrontation. There will be the challenge to deal with that. Because ministry requires that a person exemplify Christ in all aspects of his life. Secondly, we are to hold people accountable to faithfulness, to the assigned task. That they're given the responsibility and they need to be faithful to that. That doesn't mean we go in and we beat them over the head with a 2x4 if they aren't doing the job. But it means that we come alongside of them and we say, you know, it seems that you're not doing the job. How can we help you do that? And we start holding them accountable to accomplish the task. And if they need assistance, we come alongside and we assist them. We also hold them accountable to the values and beliefs of the church. That if they're doing the ministry of the church, that they need to be upholding the values and the beliefs of the church. So if they're teaching something that's contrary to the doctrine of the church, we lovingly confront them with that and say, you know, here's what we believe as a church. They need to be teaching that. And then lastly, we hold them accountable for supporting the vision of the church and the direction. While each ministry will have its own direction and each person may have their own ministry, it should never be in conflict with what the church is seeking to accomplish. And so we hold them accountable to that. But as we do that, as we clarify the responsibility, we give them authority, we hold them accountable, then we're empowering them for the ministry. And that's what we want to accomplish. Thirdly, team ministry requires an encouraging environment. In the small church, people can easily become discouraged. We become discouraged because of the struggles we face in the small church. We don't see the results that we wanted to achieve. We don't see things happening like we want them to happen. We start an outreach program and we don't see the masses coming to know Christ. And as a result, we can easily become discouraged. And so it's important for us, if we want to encourage people in ministry and encourage people in the church, to develop an encouraging environment. That means we look beyond just the visible results. That we develop a positive-based evaluation. Sometimes in ministry, we challenge people to set goals, and they set goals, and yet they don't accomplish those goals, and as a result of that, they become discouraged. And what we fail to recognize is that the hand of God is still working, and sometimes what we think is the goal that needs to be accomplished is different from what God is accomplishing, and God is using our desire to achieve this goal to actually accomplish His goal that He has established. That's the mystery of God. That's the power of God. And sometimes we need to see that. We need to look at the results and say, was there a spiritual result? It may not have been the result that we expected or thought we would get, but what was the spiritual result that we saw? And so it's a positive-based evaluation. We want to encourage people to take risks, to be innovative, to try new ideas, to not be afraid of failure. So many times people are afraid that if they fail, that it will undermine their self-worth. And we want to challenge people to not be afraid to take risks. And then we want to reward not just accomplishments, but more importantly, we want to reward faithfulness. Because that's what God examines, how faithful we are to the task. That's an encouraging environment when we encourage them to be faithful to the task, regardless of the results, knowing that God will accomplish His purpose through us. We may not see it, or it may not be the result that we thought, but God will accomplish His purpose, so we can encourage people with that. Fourth, to develop a team environment in the church, it requires a supportive environment. It means we come alongside them and we encourage them and we support them in their ministry. See, as we think about the role of the pastor and the role of the board, it's important that we realize that our role primarily is that of a servant's role. That we're to come underneath them and support them and encourage them so that they can accomplish the ministry of the church. We want to build that within our church. So that we want to encourage them and help them by listening to them. Sometimes it means that we need to sit down and say, what is it that you want to accomplish and how can I help you accomplish it? That's a supportive environment from the leadership. And then team ministry requires a unifying environment. So that we're not having the church work in a number of different directions without any unity within it. But we want a church that's working together, that's unified both in its teamwork, that they're working together, but also in its direction and purpose for the church. So we're encouraging people to do that. And then lastly, a team ministry requires gifted-oriented environment, so that people are ministering from the context of their gifts. In the small church, here's usually what happens. We need someone to be a Sunday school teacher. And so we go around and we start twisting people's arms, making them feel guilty until finally one of them will come in and say, I'll volunteer to do the ministry. But we never step back and say, what are the people that are gifted in this area? And how can they exercise their spiritual gifts? So that if they're not gifted to be a teacher, what are they gifted in? And how can we come along and help them accomplish their spiritual gifts? So that's a gift-oriented ministry. So that they have the freedom to utilize their gifts within the context of the ministries of the church. And we want to encourage people to do that. So as we develop a team ministry within the congregation, there's several things we can do to build that team. We want to have the right environment, but now what do we need to do to accomplish that? Well, first of all, it begins by developing ministry teams rather than committees. Oftentimes in the church, what we do is we begin by formulating different committees to oversee different tasks. Now, I don't have a problem with committees, but oftentimes what happens is committees tend to be organizational in focus. And so the focus becomes, how do we run this organizational structure? And it becomes the focal point of maintaining the structure. And what we want to encourage people to do and to recognize is that everything we do is ministry-oriented. So that if we're taking care of the facilities, we're not taking care of the facilities because we need to have a building, but we're taking care of the facilities because we want to provide a place for ministry to happen, for people come to know Christ. So it's a ministry-oriented team. And so we want to challenge people to think in ministry rather than just organizational structures. So as we develop our ministry, we develop ministry teams to oversee and to accomplish the different ministries of the church. Secondly, we need to maintain clear lines of communication between the teams, between the individuals involved, so that people understand what's going on. They understand the broad perspective. That involves communication. And again, in the small church, because it's relationally driven, communication is extremely important, that everyone be understanding of what's going on in the church. We can do that in a lot of different ways. We can do that through formal settings, through church bulletins, through communicative letters or inserts into the bulletin. We can do that informally. We can do that by having the different teams meet together periodically to discuss what's going on so that people can see the relationship between the ministries, so that the worship team has an opportunity to communicate with the Sunday school, some of the goals they have and how it fits into the Sunday school program, so that there's good communication between the different ministry teams within the church. Third, we maintain the accountability through board participation. Again, the board is responsible to give oversight. And so part of the responsibility of the board then is to provide oversight into the various ministries of the church. And it does that through its involvement in those ministries. And so how is the board involved? And are they being involved? And is the leadership involved on different levels? And then we need to allow decisions through policies. So that the church sets the policies, the parameters for the different ministries, so that they then can make decisions within those parameters and have the freedom to make those decisions. So we don't have to go to, the CE doesn't have to go to the finance team to ask for every $100 that they need to spend. But rather there's parameters set, and there's authority to exercise that. And then lastly, we need to focus upon spiritual growth rather than organizational maintenance within the church. See, we want to encourage people to do ministry so that the church is working together, so that the board is working with the various leaderships of different programs within the church, and that people have the freedom to accomplish that ministry, that they have the freedom to go out and do their ministry. We want to encourage that within the church, because a church will only be as strong as its ability to work together. Again, I'm convinced that if we desire to have an effective ministry, there has to be teamwork within the church. It has to be working together. It's not working in opposition to one another. An unhealthy church, churches that are struggling, will inevitably have conflicts among groups, conflicts among board members, conflicts between the pastor and the board, rather than working together. And as we think about the church, we think about understanding our culture. We need to understand our setting. We talked about that. We need to understand the environment in which we minister. Then we need to develop the ministry as spiritual leaders. That as pastors, we're called to be a spiritual leader in the church. We're called to have an influence in terms of the lives of people, in terms of our congregation, and our community. We're to be spiritual leaders, but we're also to be organizational leaders. And central to being an organizational leader is not only understanding the authority structure of the small church and the administrative tasks of the small church, but also developing an environment where there is a team orientation, that everyone is working together. The pastor is working together with the board is working together with the congregation to accomplish effective ministry. And when we're doing those things, when we're being spiritual leaders and we're effectively running our organizational structuring in a way that honors Christ, when we're doing those things, we will have an effective ministry regardless of the outward results, because we're accomplishing what God desires us to accomplish.